Super excited to have you here and also to have Tamara here in conversation with me today. So Tamara is, I'm going to give you the official bio and then I'm going to give you the Maya bio. So Tamara is an architect and principal at Stantec's Boston office. She was named one of Boston's top 50 power women in real estate, and she was also the 2016 Boston Society of Architects president. She's an architect and an urban designer. She specializes in multifamily, residential, academic, and commercial projects. Her housing portfolio includes over 1,500 units, including affordable and market rate units. And she was the senior designer for the Mass Art Treehouse project, which was described as one of the most interesting Boston high-rise projects in years by the Boston Globe. Tamara also teaches also at Mass Art, and I met Tamara a few years ago when she was, I think she was the incoming Boston Society of Architects president. And you know, I interviewed her when I first started Build Yourself, when I was getting the program off the ground. And, you know, immediately we clicked, and immediately I just thought, you know, here is someone who's sitting on all kinds of interesting strategies on how to move forward in your career, but to do it on your own terms that she's crafted through just, you know, sometimes hitting an obstacle and then figuring out her way around it. And one of the other things that I really admire about Tamara is that it's not enough for her to move forward in her career. She really wants to do it on her own terms and to, you know, I'll be a little bit woo-woo here, but to really meet her unique human potential to keep growing in her work and to also have the kind of life that she wants. And she's willing to be really honest about when it's hard, but then how she finds her way around that. So I was so excited to invite her, first of all, to be a guest blogger for me on my website, where she's written a really detailed story on how she got to where she is today and how she crafted her map. And spoiler alert, it's not, you know, it's not an old school paper map, it's more of a GPS, but today we're gonna dive into some of those strategies that she used to figure out where she wants to go. And she also talks a lot about some of the challenges that she faced along the way, and we'll dive into some of those as well, and some of her strategies for overcoming those challenges. So what I want you to think about as you listen to us is, where are you in your own life and career today? Do you have a map? Do you want a map? And what can you take from this conversation around what you can do to start writing that map and then taking action? And if you do have a map or an intention, but you feel like it's not happening, then what I'd love for you to take out of today is, okay, how do I get a little bit more fluid and flexible so I'm still moving forward towards what I want, but I'm also figuring out how to roll with the punches along the way. So with that, let's say welcome to Tamara.
Hi, Maya. Really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so glad that you're here.
Can they see me and you at the same time?
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So, well, all right. What I want to dive into first is, you've talked about this notion of there being not a paper map, right? Not a map, but a GPS. And
right.
for a little bit of context, I recently chatted with a principal at a big architecture firm who told me that people come to him all the time saying, you know, where's my map? Can you make my map for me? And he said, there is no map. You have to figure it out yourself. And I mentioned that to Tamara. And Tamara said, well, I think that it's not that there's no map, but it's a dynamic process, right? It's a fluid process. So yeah, tell us about your map, your GPS, your stance on that.
Right. Well, yeah, I totally thank you for that intro, because I think just saying there's no map is really unhelpful, right? So if you just say, well, I'm going to make a map, but it might be temporary, but it's going to be guided by the goals that I have for, like you said, 5 years or 10 years, then that gives you at least a general direction to follow, and you can try to make those plan A, plan B, plan C to try to get it done. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was really important for me, sort of because my background is, you know, I'm from I wouldn't say lower middle class family, but I just had no money, right? And yet I had this voice of my mother in my head saying, you can do it all, you can do everything, you can be anything you want to be. And so, like, I did actually look at my life and say, like, what do I want to do in my teens and my 20s and my 30s? So it was by decade.
Okay.
And so just to share that during my 20s, I really wanted to learn. So I went to college and travel. Like, I'd never traveled before. So how do I do that? In my 30s, I knew I wanted to have babies and I wanted to work, right? And so that was that decade. My 40s, it was about like, wow, how can I convert what I've learned in both those areas to be a leader, to really like take on some more responsibility. And then in my 50s, it was sort of like, how do I share that? You know, so that's sort of teaching. And in every case, I, you know, with limited resources and whatever I could see in front of me as that map, I just tried to piece together with those really basic kind of skeletal goals.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's the way I made it through. And I don't know how, like, listening to you talk about my bio and how much I've done, I'm almost shocked myself that it's like, I'm like, wow, maybe I should like cool it a little bit and like, I'm so type A. But, you know, it really was just like, I just, as you said, like want to keep growing. And so if that goal is achieved in less time than 10 years, then I just like turn my focus and I'm like, okay, now what can I do? Now what can I do?
Yeah.
And so it's been fun.
Yeah. Well, I think what I see in your story and what I see with a lot of the women who I work with is, you know, you want to keep growing over the course of your career. So you always want there to be something that you're kind of aiming towards, a kind of learning or growth edge. And what I see happen sometimes is people want to find the answer because they want to know where they're heading. And either A, they pick an answer, they achieve it, and then it's uncomfortable because it turns out that they're you know, most creatives are really growth oriented, and so like they don't recognize like, okay, it's evolving, or they get so worried about picking the wrong thing that they never choose, or having to maybe, you know, what if I get stuck, and then and what if I want to work on every typology possible, and then they don't choose, and then they end up kind of stuck and frustrated and not at their creative potential. So, you know, yeah, it sounds like working by decade versus what do I want to be by the time I die, right? It has been helpful for you. Any other strategies that you've had for balancing how fixed to get about where you wanted to go versus how fluid?
No, I think, you know, I actually learned the plan ABC from a good friend of mine in college who, you know, I said, you know, what are you doing for the summer? And she's like, well, I'm not totally sure, but I could go to Denmark, you know, and live with a family there, or I could go to California and work on a job there, or I could, and I was like, oh my God, like I never thought about it that way, you know, and she's like, if this one falls through, then I got this one and this one. And I had at the time been operating on just one. You know, oh well, this summer I'm gonna do this thing, and I'm gonna work toward it. And so I think that's a good strategy too, because you're kind of never disappointed. You know, you just sort of spray the earth with like, okay, there's enough options here that one of them is going to come true.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of, and then when that one thing comes true, the reason that I don't believe in sort of like setting that really long-term direction is because, you know, like, for example, the travel thing, right, in my 20s. So, you know, I had no money, worked for a Roach traveling scholarship, and traveled around the world for 6 months. And then after that, I was like, oh my God, I love this so much. I want to go to graduate school, and I want to go in a foreign country.
Yeah.
So I went to Amsterdam and lived there for 3 years. And who knew that while I was there, like, all I was learning about was housing. Right? And so that took my career into a different trajectory. And so each time it's, you know, it's just sort of like being able to realize like what am I learning and gaining and my strengths, and how can I just keep maximizing those strengths in the next choice and the next choice that I make. So that is to me really critical, is that people, like, you know, I'm sure all your listeners, they're not like me, and so you got to be pretty self-aware about what are those things that you have and your weaknesses. And, you know, I remember hearing somebody say, like, you also spend a lot of time working on your weaknesses at first, and then realizing, you know what, let's form a team and have other people cover the weaknesses, and I'm going to work on my strengths because that's where I shine and that's where I'm passionate. And so that was, another strategy, was just kind of keep following the passion.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever been at a point in your career where you realized you had to plan for a longer time horizon, right? Where what you wanted wasn't just clear in the next step, but you had to kind of think with a little bit further out about what will I want?
I'm not sure I'd exactly frame it that way, but I did feel like throughout my 30s that actually because of the kids and the work, I felt slowed down.
Yeah.
And that was super frustrated, because I had all these desires, and there was no way that I could unleash my type A personality and go after them. So I could actually see the map, but I had to be realistic about what I could do. And so I had, for a couple of years, literally a just say no policy, which aligned with Nancy Reagan's just say no to drugs. And mine was just say no to any extracurricular activities whatsoever. Which, sometimes you just have to accept that you're in a part of your life that you can't yet get to that.
Yeah.
And then another thing that came to mind when you said that was that sometime at the end of that phase of my life, I was getting involved a lot in the AIA and the Boston Society of Architects, and people were telling me I should want to be a principal, right? And I was just like, I see my husband, he's a principal, it's horrible. During the recession, all he did was lay people off and, be totally miserable. So, that was another one where I just I learned the lesson of this is what society tells you want to be, and this is what you either need to be or you want to be now.
Yeah.
And you just kind of keep the focus and try to stop listening to the voices out there that are telling you some other definition of success than what is your own.
Yeah. I think that's so helpful. So, I always love to roll up my sleeves. Any instincts on or advice on how to do that? How do you separate out those voices?
That's funny. Often it would be that I would end up in tears, and that was sort of a signal to myself that I wasn't listening to the real voice.
Yep.
Right?
Okay.
I was listening to everyone else, and I was trying to mold myself into that, but the real me was crying inside. And so I could start to. Somebody said to me at Omega Institute, which I was there a couple weeks ago, your body doesn't lie. And to me, that's where it is. It sits in, if I'm starting to feel like I can't breathe or I'm going to cry or whatever, then I have to look at myself and say, where am I not being honest?
Yeah.
And then always, once I'm honest, it's amazing how, you can avoid being honest because you think the whole world's going to crash down. But once you acknowledge whatever truth it is, then solutions appear again, right? And you're just oh, well, I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this, and that would alleviate some of this tension and stress that I have. But, I don't know, it's so many, I think women have this issue where you just kind of just bottle it up for a certain moment until you can't anymore.
Yeah. So Valerie Evans, I believe that's her name, PhD, she wrote a book called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And she has this concept that there are certain truths that we are, quote, truths that we're afraid to see, we're afraid to be confronted with because they're so painful. She talks about them in terms of feeling self-confident or self-doubt or imposter syndrome. But I think that they're true in a couple of other areas as well. And so, for example, if you have a deep self-belief that you're not really gifted, right? You're not as gifted as everyone thought. Being confronted with evidence that says you're not as gifted as you thought is so painful that you'll do all kinds of things in order to prevent yourself from ever facing that, turn in your work late. So it was late. It wasn't that it wasn't good enough. Put yourself in situations, surround yourself with people who are low achieving so that you can, you'll do all kinds of things to prevent yourself from having that moment of truth where the thing you're most afraid is true, is staring you in the face. But most of the time that thing isn't true, or if it is true, it's actually much more nuanced and complex. And, like you said, if you actually apply design thinking and the kind of problem solving approach that we think of in design to your issue, it's like the solutions appear. But you have to get to the point where you pull off all of these layers that you're afraid to pull off because you're afraid that the truth, you can't, your inner critic's like, you can't handle the truth. So let's just go do crazy things to prevent ourselves from ever facing it.
Right. No, and I think it's, it makes it tougher in male-dominated professions because you're surrounded by men whose general way of being is to always act completely certain of themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so to acknowledge that you don't exactly know what you're doing, whether it's work or your life path or whatever, is, you kind of avoid that generally. And so I just found that it's just better to, like I said, you just get to a point where you can no longer ignore your inner voice. And then I would always reach out. I think my mom taught me that when my parents divorced, that she got me a counselor when I was like 14. And so I had therapy, so I knew what that could do for you. Yeah. And so I sort of treated myself to that at different points in my life when I really felt stuck. I would reach out to people like you, like coaches. I'd just be like, I need someone else to be able to objectively look at who I am and where I am and then help me find a path forward. Because sometimes you're just looking at your own navel, right? And then it's like, I can't solve this either. And so having, people to help is really critical. And then, like you said, like even doing so every time I did that group of women with the coach or the single coach, then I got a homework assignment and it forced me to think more deeply about something, and then I could actually have something to act on. Yeah. And then I'm good. Like, okay, then I can implement. Right. I'm good at implementing, but you got to figure out first what the hell you want to do. Right.
It's like type A, back on. Yeah. One of the things that I see a lot, because I work with women in architecture, women in design, women in creative fields, is that there's this amazing DIY spirit. Like, we can install, I can learn carpentry and install that for sure. And sometimes that DIY spirit means that you feel like you've got to do it all yourself. You've got to make the website. You've got to figure out what you want to do with your life, and that it has to be you versus there's something almost turncoaty about inviting a professional in, or, if you don't have the funds or whatever. I'm a huge fan of having an accountability partnership. I've had one for 5 years, and we meet every week. We take annual business retreats together. But giving yourself permission to not DIY, because these key moments, if you can figure them out and figure out what you want, you can actually shoot ahead forward so much faster than if you just stayed stuck trying to figure out what you wanted.
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree. No, and I remember the BSA presidency was that for me, because just the year before, my firm had gotten acquired.
Yep.
And that was a really big turning point for me, because I had in my mind, I'm not sure I ever shared this with anybody, but I had in my mind imagined that one of my next steps was going to be to take the president of my company's job and become the next president. And then that just sort of like vanished as a possibility.
Okay.
And so I was like, I want to learn how to not just, like you're always talking about, sort of focusing on the projects and the day-to-day and the, even though that's great and that's what I was trained to do, I want to learn how to be able to lead in a bigger way.
Yeah.
And so, boom, as soon as I literally thought that thought, I was like, oh, like I swear the universe just provides this for me, right? And then I pick up the phone and I get a call from the BSA saying, would I consider running for being the next president.
Yeah.
And I'm like, of course, this is awesome. And I learned, like you said, like by acknowledging it, doing it, then I learned so much.
Yeah.
And it changed the map again.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I love that. Okay. So let's dive into, you talked about, your 40s were about leadership. So take us a little bit more in depth into how did you decide that, and what did leadership mean? Right? Like, how specific tell us, get us into that nitty gritty of that decision.
It was partly watching the president of my company who was able to function really at this different level, that somehow he had a bucket of time where he was able to really be emotionally connected to people in the firm, like on a wider basis than just I'm working with you day to day, right? Instead, it was like he was available to us to help, sort of figure out where we all wanted to go and help us get there. And then on the outside of the firm, he was really visible, right, where he was saying, this is what our firm is about, and we are great, and he was sort of harvesting work at a different level, right, of sort of the public rather than just the particular clients that we might already have.
Yeah.
So, so there was sort of operating on that larger level, and so the BSA obviously did that for me. Like, I literally started out the BSA knowing that I couldn't give a presentation without a slideshow.
Okay.
Because I was tied to having these images and being able to walk through something and have my notes and have everything planned. And I realized that he could show up at any venue and be asked to say something about something, and he could do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was like, I want that skill. How do you get that skill? Well, at the end of a year of doing, tons of presentations, suddenly I had that skill.
Yeah.
So, and I think this, and what I really learned about it, which I didn't totally understand about leadership, and this is sort of even the underlying, more meaningful thing about leadership, is that you're taking your goals and meshing them with an organization's goals, and you're taking all of the power of that organization to do those two together, right? And that was, to me, super powerful, that I could have my own goals about the AIA and the BSA, like, let's diversify our profession, let's talk about important issues like affordability in housing, or, whatever. Those are my goals.
Yeah.
But how can I work with an entire organization to get people so that they're following but also leading, as I've touched something in them that they find is important, and that they're going to go out and advocate and implement and be allies, right? And so and I use that all the time now, but go ahead, you were going to say something.
Well, I really want to emphasize and what you said about it's your own goals plus the organization's goals, because what I see happen over and over again is, actually, I'll tell it through stories. I see women feel hesitant to put their own goals into the mix. I think there's something about a culture of service, right? We worry about putting our needs, and we're raised to put other people's needs ahead of our own, right? We're the mother nurturer, even if we don't become actual mothers, right? And I remember when I was in grad school, seeing many of my male professors treat the studios they were running as, and again, it was a small subset. So is this because of the way where they were socialized, or is this just the way it happened to be? Don't know, but I saw many of my male professors, not all, treat the studios as their engine for their research effort, and even down to the level of, sometimes, once I remember with one professor, I would always get feedback on whether or not I had followed his color guidelines versus the actual content of my presentation, which I think is a little bit too far, right? Because primary goal is that I should learn, secondary goal is your research empire. But I
No, I
think,
remember I got
yeah,
invited to talk at Yale a while back, and I walked through the studios, and I realized, I was like, oh, that's Greg Lynn's studio, and that's
uh-huh,
Stan Allen's studio, and that's, the OMA studio,
yeah,
because everybody was just like literally
yeah,
forced to.
yeah,
I could never
yeah,
be that kind of professor.
yeah. So that's, that's the end of the spectrum that I think many of us don't want to hit, and some people find not ethical to hit. I don't find it ethical to be at that point on the spectrum. But on the other side of the spectrum, one of the women who I worked with ended up being on the board of an organization and just really struggled to say, well, what are my goals for my own career? Are there ways that I can find linkages and hybrids where the ways that I want to grow in my career line up with how this organization moves forward? Because part of the reason why you are elected into that position or appointed or chosen
Right.
or stepped up is that there's something about who you are uniquely that is of value. And what I loved about your BSA presidency is that you've been termed the mother of microhousing, right? And your BSA presidency in part was part of you solidifying that reputation, but it was because you focused on housing affordability, which is one of the biggest issues, possibly the biggest issue in the built environment in Boston. And so it wasn't like you were like off doing the Tamara show, but you were finding these synergies between your own professional trajectory and what the organization needed, and trusting that part of what it needed was what you had to give. And it's like, I just wish we could like give permission to all women to kind of get a little bit closer to what could
Right,
seem
right.
like the self-serving part of the spectrum, because
Yeah, and
yeah,
it's true. I mean, the helpful part of that is, literally the first question that they ask you when you consider being nominated as president of the BSA is, what is your agenda going to be?
right,
So that's great, like, because I think, like you're saying, like, if you're not asked that question, then you should be asking yourself that question, but
yeah,
sometimes you don't know to ask that question,
yeah,
right? But instead, they were asking me, and so that helped, because I don't know if well, I mean, of course, I think at that point in my career, I would have known anyway that that was my agenda.
yeah,
um, but what was I going to say? Oh, so no, because then there's the president-elect, who's a good friend of mine for next year, for 2020, has been calling me, and she's been using me as a coach about
mm-hmm.
how she can organize her year and trying to figure out all the things that I learned. And so, she's really interested in making Boston a design city, right?
Yeah,
So that's sort of her agenda. And one of the conversations that really helped me figure out what I learned was guiding her to say that you only have 1 year, right? And
mm,
it's not a bad thing to look at your life that way,
yeah,
actually. Like, here's
yeah,
you have a year, and so there's no way the first thing people think about to do is to, like you said, do it yourself, dream up all these committees, you're going to start everything, and then at the end of a year, you're not going to have anything to show for it. So
yeah,
really what you need to do as a
okay,
leader is look around and see all the people that are already doing this stuff that's really amazing, and that you can use your presidency to shine a light on, get them money, get them talking to each other, get them moving in a bigger direction,
yeah,
right? And then your year is going to pass, and you're going to be like, oh my God, like so much was accomplished.
yeah,
And that's, sort of reaching out and finding those partners. And I think that's true as well, in just about any sphere, is
yeah,
that rather than thinking you're going to do it yourself, or, you're going to start something from scratch, there's so many people who are already doing this stuff, so link arms with them and march forward.
yeah, yeah. So, okay, so this moment when you were BSC president, I want to go back to something you said. And had you already decided, were you already a principal at the time? And had you decided you wanted to be a principal? Because I'm holding, on one hand, everyone said, you should be a principal. And I was like, nah. And then on the other hand, I'm hearing, I know from your story, you chose to become a principal, right? And that's a, I call it a North Star goal, right? It's a goal you set and you weren't going to get there overnight, right? It's kind of a longer term goal. So were you a principal? at that point, what I'd love for us to hear is to have you walk us through how you set that goal for yourself and then how you achieved it.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, part of it was that I needed to get my kids so that they were like over 10 years old, both of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they were a little more self-sufficient. And so that was when I stopped saying no to everything, and started to think again about, okay, what do I want? And I had been collaborating with other principals for a long time, because a lot of our principals are managing principals and they needed a design lead, and I wasn't a design principal, I was just the lead designer on the projects, and that was working okay, but there was a part where, you know, if I was being honest, where I was often frustrated, where that hierarchy meant that the managing principal was having the conversation with the client up here, and I was over here, and I was having to just, you know, basically get whatever they decided. I wasn't even part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think out of that frustration, and realizing that I at least wanted to be an equal, I started to move toward climbing that ladder. And then there were a couple of roadblocks on that ladder itself, which I won't get distracted by, but there definitely were. And, you know, but eventually I did get there, and then I sort of started to work more equally.
Mm-hmm.
And now what I'm finding, which is really fascinating, is that sometimes I'll actually choose to be the one principal on the project and have a project manager under me, rather than having to have a constant negotiation and consensus building with an equal.
Yeah.
So that's been an interesting kind of arc for me.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to put into kind of a series of steps the Tamara Roy approach to making your map. So
Okay.
bear with me. So step one, think about your life as a series of increments. I hear you talk about these time scales, right? Rather than just being in, you know, okay, go to work. I go to work the next day. I see you kind of zooming out and thinking at these different time scales. And there's something about that thinking that I think helps you create more of a sense of where are you going. Number two, pay attention to both your frustrations and your aspirations and use them to guide what comes next, right? So I heard you say, I wanted to have more agency in my projects, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to become, I decided to set my goal for this role, right? And one of the things I do want to say is that your map isn't always a career level. It may be a kind of a way of being. It may be a skill set. It may be an achievement, right? I also heard you say, you know, on the aspirations front, I loved watching this past, I think it was your principal, who could just own any topic in any room. And that's, you know, an aspiration to pay attention to, because it says something about the way that you're wired, right? So number three, set a vision and a goal, right? You know, at one point in your career, you said, I want his job, right? I'm going to be the big boss. I want to be in charge of this whole, like, that's the role that I want. And, you know, aim for that, right? And one of the things we haven't talked about, but I will want to talk about a little bit in just a minute, is the role of mentors. Because I know, you know, it hasn't just been kind of coaches and guides that have helped you figure out where you want to go, right? Turn those aspirations and frustrations into, but where would I go to solve this? What would I do about it? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But that step is to kind of set an intention about where you want to go. And then if that intention doesn't work, right? If plan A doesn't work out, then go back to the core that was driving it and ask, well, how else could I achieve this, right? Find your plan B, and then allow each of those things to kind of open up that next cycle of where do we go from here.
Right. And so all of that, I think the only thing maybe that you missed is ask for help.
Ask for help. Okay.
Ask for help at every opportunity. Right. There was a point where I felt so lonely being a woman in this field, And then I joined the Women Principals group before I was a principal.
Okay.
And I begged, I felt so like an imposter. I'd show up to their meetings and I'd be like, are you sure it's okay for me to be here? I'm only a senior associate, you know? And they're just like, Tamara, it's fine, let it go, like, you know, and just hang out with us. And it was, very helpful to have them, or to have, all mentors. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, well, you also, I mean, I remember you were at a career trajectory, and one of the things you did, which I now recommend to women who I work with all the time, is you looked outside of your firm. A lot of us tend to look for mentors inside our practice. You looked within your practice, but then also outside, so you can get a wider landscape for women who you admired, and then you just asked a whole bunch of them to lunch, right? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about that and how it helped you figure things out.
Yeah, that was one of my coaches in my, you know, sort of kind of transitional phases, where I had left a firm that I was so burnt out and so miserable, and that was that glass ceiling firm that I stayed in way too long. And so I went to this coach, and she just said, and I said, I just don't know what to do next. I don't know if I can keep doing these kinds of projects. What should I do?
Yeah.
And she just said, go find people you admire and call them up. And so I did, like, through friends of friends, and I had a couple of those lunches. The one that really rang a bell was with Rebecca Barnes, who at the time was head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. And, you know, it wasn't that that she had a job that I necessarily would ever aspire to, but it was her talking to me about how she got that job that she wanted that ended up resonating with me, that she could just set her sights and make her way there. And I was, oh my God, you can do this. Because I was really only like in my early 30s then, and I just didn't understand that it was more than just trying to be good at the job that you're doing today.
Yeah.
So, you know, she was just like, again, another North Star.
Yeah, I love that you say that. So I'll say, I think our approaches to creating your map are pretty similar. So what I have women do is I have them create we call it a North Star. And we call it a North Star in part because, like a GPS, you got to type something in, right? You got to know, like, am I going to California or am I going to Florida? And you know, that I'll share a couple of examples. Because the North Star is usually at least 5 years out, right? It's not next year. It's not right in front of you. It's usually 5 years out, maybe 10. You know, I'm working with some women now who have set North Stars to found specific types of creative businesses, but that, you know, right now they need to be like that risk and independence isn't quite right for them. I've had women who've set North Stars to become principals at their practices and, you know, focus on specific set of issues. Some women's North Stars are really just about the kind of expert that they want to be and what that it would look like to be that expert. And so what I suggest is that you want your North Star to have enough of a resolution that you can see it and kind of, you know, it can kind of move you and you can make choices off of it. But you don't want it to be so specific that you get bogged down in the details and the picture, just like, you know, a photo kind of resolving, it gets clearer as you move towards it. But the thing about a North Star is that you want to kind of set your goals for, I'm going to San Francisco, and then you don't necessarily need to know exactly what the specific address is, or if you find out that actually there's a better Airbnb in Santa Cruz, like you can kind of, you know, at least you're moving in the right direction. The idea is that you want it to give you enough intel that you can actually make a plan about next steps in order to get there. You can figure out what kind of help to ask for. And then I would say, and because I think you've talked about this a little bit, you also want to make sure that that North Star is ambitious, right? It's like, I think part of what Rebecca did for you is say, like, you can choose. And like, what if you shot, Barbara Nazarevic, who's also a Stantec, a landscape architect at Stantec, says, you know, I'd rather shoot for the stars and reach the moon, right? You know, it's like the moon's still pretty good, right?
Yeah, totally. No, in the Where's My Map piece, I mean, it's slightly different, but the North Star for me became Kay Sloan, who was the president of Mass Art. Yeah. And for me, the North Star was less a place or a a kind of achievement or doing something. It was finding a person who embodied a type of working and leadership style that I admired, and because I was always faced with sort of male role models in leadership, and they're often just, I don't know, not a little bit brutal, but like, you know, they're clearly hierarchical.
Yeah.
And hers was a much warmer, softer, very listening kind of way of being first and foremost.
Yeah.
And then, but always fluctuating back to not losing herself, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing when it was time for her to step forward and when it was time for her to recede. And this, to me, she's still my North Star for that, because that's exactly what now, you know, I deal with on a daily basis, is when is it that I'm going to take my team and go, wow, here they are, aren't they great? You know, and when is it my time to say, listen, I believe in this, and this is what we need to do.
Yeah.
And clients, you know, and families and, you know, relationships, they all need you to negotiate that balance. And
Absolutely.
I feel like, as you said, women are trained to tend to err on the side of the balance that everybody else gets listened to. And it's not until you're literally in tears, frustrated, tearing your hair out, that you hear that little tiny voice inside going like, where am I? You know, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's gotten, I think the more you do it, it's like anything with practice, the more you hear it, and then the less painful it is to listen to it, because you know, last time I listened to it, there was a good result. Let me keep doing this.
Yeah, yeah. And then that ongoing process of, you don't just arrive there, but it's a, you know, you set your sights, you achieve and roll with the punches, right? And we haven't talked as much about some of the obstacles you face, but they're in the blog post, as well as your strategies for getting around them. And if you haven't read it, it's an amazing post. I really, really recommend it. You set your sights, you respond and roll with the punches, and then it's going to happen again. You're going to be there again, because you are a growth-oriented person. You're creative. There is a next growth edge for you. And when you find yourself in that place again, you'll say, okay, wait, like, I've been here before, you know, it's time for me to kind of maybe tweak that GPS a little bit, but I know how to do this because I've been here before. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
There's a method to the madness.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. We went from there is no map to where is my map to here's some steps you can take on how to find your map.